President Trump says he's moving to ban large companies from buying single family houses. But does the White House have the power to do this? And is it really what ails the American housing market?
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We're joined today by my colleagues on the Journal's editorial pages, columnists Alicia Finley and Kim Strassel. Today's news story begins, as so many often do, with a Truth Social post from President Trump. Here was from Wednesday. I am immediately taking steps to ban large institutional investors from buying more single-family homes, and I will be calling on Congress to codify it. People live in homes, not corporations. I will discuss this topic, including further housing and affordability proposals and more, at my speech in Davos in 2 weeks, unquote. Alicia, to start with, give us a sense of how big institutional investors are in the United States housing market. And that might give some perspective on the size of what the president here is suggesting is a problem.
Well, the top 24 single-family rental companies, which is really what we're talking about here, like the Amhersts, Invitation Homes, these aren't exactly household names for a reason, because they actually aren't all that big. They own about 520,000 homes in the U.S. That's less than 1% of the total supply. Now, there are rental homes as a total do make up a larger share of the market, maybe I think about 7 or 8% is what I've seen. The vast majority of those are owned by small investors. And by that, I mean fewer than 10 properties. So small investors actually account for about 87% of the market, while the largest investors only account for around 2%. And one reason for that is that there actually are bigger benefits in terms of government guarantees, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, for small investors. So Fannie Mae will guarantee investor properties for borrowers with up to 10 loans, which is actually a pretty nice subsidy. So they're actually small investors make up a much larger share of the market than large investors, but altogether, both sets of investors are still a very small share of the total housing market.
Large investors have also been selling more homes lately, according to some of the news stories this week, than they are buying. Blackstone, one of these companies often that comes up in these conversations, says it has been a net seller for about a decade now. And Kim, when we're talking about small investors, often these are mom and pop operations. It's somebody who owned a house and lived in it and then moved, upgraded to a bigger house across town, but kept their existing one to use as a rental. Or it's people who have extra capital. They're trying to figure out where to invest. And so they buy a house across town and they fix it up and they rent it out. And maybe they end up with a couple of properties. But the thing that is always a bit perplexing to me in this conversation is when you have investors that are buying single family houses with the intent to rent them out, it is not as if they disappear from the housing stock. People are not buying those homes and leaving them empty and taking them out of town. They are still being used for a rental for somebody. And I get that maybe there are people who see the single family home for purchase market as separate from the rental market. And to some extent, that's probably true. But to the extent that we have a housing problem in the United States, a single family home that is being converted into a rental is still being used for housing for somebody who would have to rent someplace else.
Right. And that's the one part of this that Donald Trump actually got right when he wrote it, even though he then went in the wrong direction. He said, people live in homes, not corporations. True. People live in homes, whether they're owned by corporations or not. So whether you're doing these rentals, again, whether you're doing them through a big company, whether you're doing it through a smaller investor, I mean, the question always needs to be, are people able to get what they need as their housing stock? And in that regard, he's kind of missing the boat. I would also point out here, I mean, some of the other talking points when it comes to this are the argument is, well, we don't like big corporate investors because they get tax advantages. In reality, those tax advantages are exceedingly small. They're not arguably big enough to drive this practice. Also, individual buyers can deduct mortgage interest and property taxes. They have capital gains exclusions. So there are benefits for individual buyers as well, too. Another thing that the argument that populists like to make is that, well, having these folks out there in the market, they get an advantage when they go to buy because they can make all cash offers. And it is true that oftentimes people who are selling homes really like the idea of an all cash offer. But, individual buyers do this a great deal of the time, too. In 2024, 70% of the all cash offers out there were made by individuals. Many of them who were selling, their own homes in which they'd accumulated some equity, and then they had that money to put down for a different purchase. So it's not really clear that the presence of investor-owned firms like this, investor-owned homes, are in any way disadvantaging regular homeowners, taking any stock out of the market, gaming the system through tax advantages. This seems to be more about kind of a desire to just beat on big in this sort of populist fervor. And the problem in my mind, Kyle, is that it's missing some of the real drivers of housing costs. It's ignoring some of the actual problems in the rush to make it look as though the administration cares about home prices. And in fact, if anything, could actually be boomeranging because, when you're scapegoating investors, you end up with policies that could actually have adverse consequences for the home market altogether.
Alicia, what's your view of this argument that is often made that investors buying homes enjoy advantages, that it's not a level playing field compared to people who are intending to buy a home to live in? So here is Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent in a speech this week, a day or so after Trump's tweet. He said, these big institutions buy housing, then rent them out, and they're able to depreciate it. They hide their earnings, pay lower taxes, unquote. Do you think there's much to that case?
Well, they are allowed to depreciate their assets, just like any other business is, just like any other company that invests in multifamily housing, apartment buildings. It's a neutral tax code insofar that anyone who invests in commercial or investment or housing can depreciate these assets on the same schedule. Now that's not necessarily even a bigger benefit than individual homeowners, by the way, get. And for individual homeowners, there are a lot of benefits. For instance, they can deduct their mortgage interest, they can deduct their property taxes as part of the state and local tax deduction. They actually get an exemption up to $500,000 for capital gains if they're living in the property for couples. And so I would actually argue there are many more benefits, and I would actually put some of these in the category of subsidies for individual owners to buy homes than there are for the investors.
Kim, if we're making the case here that this is missing the real problem in the housing market, you're suggesting that it's a supply problem, essentially. And I tend to agree with that. And some of that is more amenable to policy solutions than other pieces of it. We've had all sorts of stories about permitting delays and problems of building infrastructure and difficulties getting through environmental reviews. I also think some of it just has to do with status quo bias. So if you move from a city out into the suburbs, you did that for a reason because you like it a little bit quieter, a little bit less dense, less traffic. So, for example, where I live, there's been a long-running campaign to save the forest. There's a piece of forest land that is being talked about as a potential development. And if you live across from the forest and you own a home, I get why you really like the fact that there's a forest there. On the other hand, that leaves out people who are not yet homeowners, given that there are not a whole lot of places in very developed areas of the country, the Northeast, California particularly, not a lot of places that are not protected land to put new developments already.
Yeah, I mean, look, what's really driving housing costs here? I think we need to get to that first. I mean, and there's been a real increase, a 50% increase in housing prices since early 2020. And of course, the problem, the biggest aspect of this is inflation, which was then followed by higher interest rates to try to keep inflation in check. And you've got a whole number of people out there right now who locked in these very low mortgage rates. They now are very concerned about moving because they're going to get hit with a much higher mortgage rate. That actually constrains their ability to kind of move up in the world, get a bigger house, pay less for it, in terms of, they might have built up equity, but if they're going to spend a whole bunch of it now on higher mortgage costs for the sake of moving, that's a problem. That has meant fewer homes for sale. People are not moving around the way that they used to. That's a temporary issue. And by the way, the Trump administration's best bet for doing it would actually be fixing that, was to focus more on the economy, to make sure that the economy is doing better, and to ease the way for interest rates to come down further. I think there's also, as you mentioned, zoning regulations and permitting and other things that get in the way of new construction. One more thing that I would add, and it hasn't got a lot of attention, but government costs also add to this. And it's kind of striking to me, the president is making this proposal this week at the very moment that the House of Representatives is actually, for once, passing some legislation that would, in fact, materially lower the cost of an enormously important housing option for many lower income Americans. That's manufactured housing. This is a huge market these days. We have come a long way from those little mobile home trailers that you think of for manufactured home. You can get these big, beautiful custom spaces with vaulted ceilings delivered right to your property. And they're very popular because the average cost of one is about $127,000 compared to about $413,000 for a house that's built on site on your property. So they make up a real percentage of single family home starts. But they cost more than they should, because a long time ago, government got in the way. The federal government, the feds regulate manufactured homes because they can be transported across state lines. It used to be the Department of Housing and Urban Development oversaw all the regulation. And then Democrats got the Energy Department into the process of also imposing new regulations and these energy efficiency mandates, which have added thousands of dollars in cost to these homes. So the House is going to pass legislation, I think today, that reestablishes HUD as the primary regulator. That's going to lower the costs of homes. The administration should be out talking about things like this. These are real solutions, unlike this kind of populist nonsense that comes from beating on investor-owned homes.
Alicia, how much can President and the White House do on his own here? I mean, to his credit, in this Truth Social post, he says he will be calling on Congress to codify these rules that he wants for investor-owned single-family home purchases. But does the president on his own have any ability to impose those in the first place?
No, it doesn't look like it. We still don't know what he's going to order. He hasn't actually issued the executive order, so we don't know what authority he plans to call on. But I think the fact that he even said in his Truth Social post that he plans to call on Congress to codify this suggests that he realizes he doesn't have the authority to do so by fiat. And in fact, even Democrats are howling and saying that he doesn't. And of course, they often urged Biden to take executive actions that exceeded his authority. And they've in fact also introduced legislation to limit housing or rental housing. California Governor Newsom and some actually other governors and both Republican Democrats are considering putting some kind of restrictions on this, which I think would be create some kind of unintended consequences, to Kim's point. Now, I think the Trump does have certain authorities and to do things to boost the housing market, some of which I think would be good, some of which I worry could have negative side effects. It's something that I think I would encourage him to do, is to use that Federal Housing Finance Agency, which oversees Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, to ban them from guaranteeing investment homes in vacation and vacation homes, which now make up about 9% of their portfolios. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, they weren't established to provide essentially people, or to provide affluent people the ability to essentially create investment opportunities, or for that matter, to vacation in Miami whenever they want. Now, that doesn't mean you're banning people from buying second homes or investment properties. It just means that you're removing the government guarantee for those homes, which, by the way, also tend to default at a higher rates. And so that would actually at least, perhaps force them to pay higher interest rates, or to some extent. But I think that's actually a distortion right now in the market, is that the GSEs, the government-sponsored enterprises, are really covering and backstopping a lot of homes that a lot of homes, high-end homes, they have a conforming loan limit of up to 1.3 million. And actually, this is mortgage. That's not the value of the home. That encourages people to buy more expensive homes and bigger homes. And that just drives up the prices. So I think trying to reform Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac is really where the focus should be.
Kim, what about the sort of left-right politics here? Because the message that the Trump administration is sending is essentially, we know there are problems in the housing market. We hear you, and it's that guy's fault. And that guy is investors, it's Wall Street, it's some shadowy figure. And it's the kind of thing that we're used to hearing from Democrats, from Elizabeth Warren, greedflation. It's the food companies, the grocery stores are driving up prices, shadowy figures in the notoriously high margin grocery business. I say tongue in cheek. It's a little bit strange to be seeing the same sort of rhetoric coming from a Republican administration. What do you think accounts for that?
Well, we're seeing it way too often, in my view. There's a faction of the GOP, including at times Donald Trump, although I would note that he does it less than some other younger members of his party, who are chasing after these base populist politics, which include the notion of beating on the rich and taking swipes at corporations. And you've seen these flirtations with higher corporate taxes or on antitrust policy, beating on big tech for the sake of beating on big tech. Earlier this year last year we had DOJ being asked by Donald Trump to investigate price fixing in meat packers. And by the way, this is very questionable politics in my mind, but it's obviously terrible economics. And on the politics, one problem is that this is a pure progressive talking point. So, yay team, Donald Trump, you're now exactly in the exact same space as Elizabeth Warren on this issue. And in fact, that you had Democrats point out recently that, well, we tried to do this not long ago and Republicans blocked us. Well, yes, they did, because it was a really terrible idea. And you've got Ms. Warren out there saying, yeah, I've been working for this for years. So now you have Republicans on the same side. That's very confusing for voters, because they'll, I think at some point, begin to wonder, well, if really like Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump are all on the same page, why does it matter who I vote for in the end? So there's that. And also, again, if your goal is popularity in government, and to be reelected and to keep a governing majority in the Congress, the most important thing the Trump team can be doing right now is improving the economy. And to the extent that these, in fact, are dreadful economic measures that are likely to backfire and don't address the root causes of housing prices at the moment, they could be causing themselves more damage than not. That is certainly the history we have seen of these kind of proposals when Democrats have been able to enact them.
And the problem with this kind of scapegoating, if I can characterize it that way, populist scapegoating, is that it promises voters you're going to fix the problem and then doesn't actually do anything to fix the problem, and often makes the problem worse. And Alicia, we are seeing a lot of that lately in New York City. Of course, the city has rent stabilization laws. Those were tightened in recent years. Voters were promised that would fix the problem. It hasn't fixed the problem. Now you have Zoran Mamdani marching in here, promising to freeze the rent. going after his inauguration to this building where residents have complained that their apartments have been kept in disrepair, but the building's owner is in bankruptcy. It's almost a spiral, a downward spiral of broken economics. Alicia, what's your read of the options that Mamdani is looking at as he tries to figure out how to deliver on his promise to New York City voters that he's going to do some good for the housing problems in their town?
Well, what Mondani really and his socialist democratic friends and supporters really are pushing is for actually an expanded government role and ownership in these apartment buildings. And what you see or saw last week is he directed his administration to intervene in the bankruptcy of this. They call it a slumlord, but it's a real estate developer that owned about 80 rent stabilized apartment buildings in the city called Pinnacle Group. And yes, it had a lot of violations, code violations, rodent infestations, mold, all these kinds of problems that you see in communist countries that result from a lack of investment, maintenance, and price controls. And in fact, the Pinnacle Group blamed the 2019 rent law that really restricted its ability to pay for upgrades or maintenance for driving into bankruptcy. Now, I don't think that this is just an incidental and unintended side effect of these policies. If you actually listen to Mamdani and his new housing czar, Sia Weaver, it's actually their goal. They actually do want to make these properties so unprofitable that it bankrupts these companies, and then they want the city and nonprofits to take them over. And that's what they're actually driving at in this bankruptcy court. They're hoping for the city to take these or acquire these properties rather than another company developer that has made a bid known as Summit, because they believe that the city, this is hilarious, that the city will do a better job maintaining them than any private operator does. Never mind that the New York City Public Housing Authority is in shambles. They have road stations are even in worse shape than many of these other rent stabilized apartment buildings. But this really is their ideological imperative. They believe that there shouldn't be any profit, that people shouldn't be able to make any profit from housing, and it really is a public right or public good.
So far, Mayor Mamdani is standing by that tenant czar that Alicia mentioned a moment ago, Sia Weaver, after the surfacing of old tweets she made talking about how home ownership is a weapon of white supremacy, calling to seize private property. Kim, we'll give you the last word, but the Mamdani team is saying that she was vetted, that they knew about these tweets beforehand. But notable story this week, reporters confronted Sia Weaver on the street and said, do you have any comment about the apparently $1.4 to $1.6 million valued home that your mother owns in Nashville? Should that be seized and so forth? And apparently she fled from those reporters, getting a little bit emotionally upset. And so another example here, I think, of cheap talk, cheap populist talk. This is what we're going to do. It becomes harder when you actually are in office and have to try to give something, deliver something to the voters who put you there.
Not just that, but, not necessarily living as how you speak. Now, obviously, this is her mother. Apparently, it's a home that her mother owns. But we see this all the time. I still remember the days when Bernie Sanders, our socialist Democrat du jour, used to complain about millionaires. Now he only complains about billionaires because he has become a millionaire himself after he wrote a best-selling book. I mean, isn't that nice? Or my other favorite one are all of these, climate purists who jet around the world in private aircraft and then make lots of excuses for why it's necessary because they're saving the planet. As you say, Kyle, it's one thing to moralize and to tell everyone how they should live their lives until you realize that living life is something that is a little bit more complex than they make it out to be. Now, it's funny, Sia Weaver, she's been quizzed a lot about these prior comments that she made, and she's now saying, oh, well, these are comments I made when I was younger, which I probably wouldn't say now. And if she really has evolved on this topic, then I guess that's for the good. But she clearly has not evolved enough to have any intelligent ideas about how to fix New York's housing problem. And so that's what I kind of hope. I mean, it is notable to dig up these things she said in the past, understand where she's coming from. But I think the importance is to keep focus on what she's saying now and what Mamdani is saying now, because as Alicia said, this is very dangerous, I think, for a lot of people who depend on lower income housing in cities like New York. And these proposals that they are pursuing are going to make things infinitely worse, not better.
Thank you, Kim and Alicia. Thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button. And we'll be back next week with another edition of Potomac Watch.